Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela.
It was just like watching television. Huddled in a draped-off room at Mar-a-Lago around screens set up for his viewing pleasure, including, according to photos released by the White House, a live feed of social media messages on X, President Donald Trump watched and listened as highly trained American Delta Force soldiers rushed into Nicolás Maduro's home in Caracas, where the Venezuelan leader was sleeping alongside his wife. Maduro was quickly dragged into custody as he tried to flee to his steel-enforced safe room. It was the dramatic culmination of a months-long campaign whose ultimate goal has long been clear to those involved in its planning: to oust Maduro from power. Trump, who at points along the way voiced misgivings about the potential for unintended consequences and the chances the U.S. could be drawn into a prolonged war, put aside any reservations and gave a green light to the operation in the days before Christmas. It wasn't until more than a week later that the weather cleared and conditions were right for the heavily guarded mission. At 10:46 p.m. ET, after making a shopping excursion for marble and onyx and enjoying dinner on the Mar-a-Lago patio, the president gave the final go-ahead. Good luck, Trump told the assemblage of national security officials who had convened at his gilded private club in South Florida, and Godspeed. American helicopters were soon gliding across the sea, 100 feet above the dark water toward Caracas. A couple of hours later, Maduro was in U.S. custody, handcuffed, dressed in gray sweatpants, and wearing blackout goggles, according to a picture Trump posted on Truth Social on Saturday morning. Trump emerged Saturday to declare the United States would now run the country for an indeterminate future, offering strikingly little detail and claiming he wasn't afraid of boots on the ground. For a president whose political movement was fueled, in part, over resentments over 2 decades of bloody American foreign intervention, it was a remarkable turnabout. The president mostly glossed over the work that may lie ahead, focusing instead on obtaining access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves and repeatedly declining to rule out a more robust U.S. military presence if Maduro's allies refused to cede power. In the hours after the strike, sources around Washington, including congressional staffers and allies of the president, privately voiced concerns about the long-term consequences of the action, both in terms of U.S. national security and the potential political fallout for a president with low approval ratings whose base has shown little appetite for American intervention abroad. A strike months in the making. At Trump's side this week in Florida have been the chief architects of the escalating pressure campaign on Maduro, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and senior advisor Stephen Miller, who were seen at dinner with the president hours before the operation began. They joined him again as he proclaimed victory on Saturday. Preparations for the raid began in mid-December, people familiar with the plans told CNN, but the vision had been planted months earlier. Even before the first U.S. military strike on an alleged drug-carrying boat from Venezuela in early September, the plan to remove Maduro from power was already in motion. While the U.S. was visibly building up its military assets in the Caribbean, moving warships and other materiel to the region, another buildup was happening in secret. In August, the CIA covertly installed a small team inside Venezuela to track Maduro's patterns, locations, and movements, which helped bolster Saturday's operation as to his exact whereabouts, including where he would be sleeping, sources familiar with the plans told CNN. The team found out, quote, how he moved, where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said Saturday. The assets included a CIA source operating within the Venezuelan government who assisted the United States with tracking Maduro's location and movements ahead of his capture, one source briefed on the operation told CNN. The detailed timeline and the revelation that a CIA team has been operating inside Venezuela for so long sheds new light on the administration's pressure campaign on Maduro for the past several months, even as senior officials publicly stated their goal was not regime change. Several Democratic members of Congress on Saturday accused Rubio and Hegseth of lying to lawmakers during a Senate briefing last month. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey wrote in a post on X that Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth looked every senator in the eye a few weeks ago and said this wasn't about regime change. I didn't trust them then, and we see now that they blatantly lied to Congress. In October, Trump said he authorized the CIA to operate inside Venezuela to clamp down on illegal flows of migrants and drugs from the South American nation. The CIA declined to comment. Pretty much an ultimatum. Late last month, the CIA carried out a drone strike on a port facility on the coast of Venezuela, sources familiar with the matter previously told CNN, marking the first known U.S. attack inside that country. The strike targeted a remote dock on the Venezuelan coast that the U.S. government believed was being used by the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua to store drugs and move them onto boats for shipping, the sources said. No one was present at the facility at the time it was struck, so there were no casualties, according to the sources. Despite the plans being drafted to oust Maduro, many White House officials had continued to hold out hope in recent weeks that Maduro would voluntarily step down, two senior White House officials told CNN. During a phone call between Trump and Maduro in November, the American president repeatedly stressed to the Venezuelan leader that it would be in his best interest to step down and leave the country, one official said, calling the conversation pretty much an ultimatum. I want to be clear about one thing. Nicolás Maduro had multiple opportunities to avoid this. He was provided multiple, very, very, very generous offers, and chose instead to act like a wild man, chose instead to play around, and the result is what we saw tonight. As recently as the beginning of December, the administration believed it was beginning to see cracks in Maduro's support system, one official told CNN. As time went by, however, that belief began to dissipate, and planning for the operation began. Once Trump gave the go-ahead in late December, the operation was disrupted by several factors, including the weather in Venezuela and the president's decision to strike Nigeria on Christmas, one official said. Conditions ripen for a strike. Kane said Saturday that Operation Absolute Resolve was the culmination of months of planning and rehearsals involving 150 aircraft and personnel across military and intelligence agencies. The troops tapped to participate then had to wait for the ideal conditions, Kane said, and were on standby through the holidays as weather delayed the operation. Last night, the weather broke. Just enough, clearing a path that only the most skilled aviators in the world could maneuver through, Kane said. Once Trump gave the go-ahead just before 11 p.m. ET, U.S. military aircraft began taking off from 20 bases in the Western Hemisphere, Kane said. Those aircraft would deliver precision strikes on Venezuelan ground targets, such as air defense systems, and provide cover for the helicopters carrying the extraction team to Caracas. The U.S. also deployed cyber warfare tactics to help clear a path for its teams operating in the sky and on the ground, Kane said. The helicopters with the extraction team reached Maduro's compound at 2 a.m. local time in Caracas, the general said. At arrival, the helicopters came under fire and one was hit but remained flyable. The U.S. returned fire in defense, Kane added. As the operation unfolded at the compound, our air and ground intelligence teams provided real-time updates to the ground force, ensuring those forces could safely navigate the complex environment without unnecessary risk. Kane said Maduro and his wife gave up to the U.S. military personnel before being flown out of the country. Maduro and Flores were placed aboard the USS Iwo Jima, which stopped at the U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay, two sources familiar with the plans told CNN. The base, sometimes referred to as Gitmo, is in southeastern Cuba and is home to the notorious detention camp. There, Maduro and his wife were transferred to a plane which landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York on Saturday evening. Maduro was first indicted alongside 14 other people in 2020 during Trump's first administration in the Southern District of New York. Maduro first came to power in 2013 and was sworn in to a third term as president 1 year ago, despite evidence that he did not win the preceding presidential election. The future of Venezuela's oil reserves. The U.S. action was a stunning culmination of months of rising threats from Trump and his administration toward Maduro. Carried out without congressional authorization, it immediately drew pushback and questions from lawmakers. In his remarks, Trump said U.S. oil companies were prepared to make major investments in the country. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country, he said. Trump said it wouldn't cost the U.S. anything to run Venezuela, pointing to the country's oil production, saying, "The money coming out of the ground is very substantial." Later, he told reporters, "We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground, and that wealth is going to the people of Venezuela and people from outside of Venezuela that used to be in Venezuela, and it goes also to the United States of America in the form of reimbursement for the damages caused us by that country." In her remarks on state television, Rodriguez accused the U.S. of instituting regime change solely for the purpose of extracting oil and other natural resources from Venezuela. The U.S. only had one objective, regime change in Venezuela, and that this regime change allows them to capture our energy resources, mineral resources, and natural resources, she said. Stefan Dujarric, a spokesman for United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, said Saturday that Guterres was deeply alarmed by the recent escalation in Venezuela and that the U.S. operation had potential worrying implications for the region. In a statement after the strikes, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, celebrated, writing, "Venezuelans, the hour of freedom has arrived." In the U.S., Trump's allies celebrated the unprecedented incursion on Venezuelan soil as a win against drug trafficking and for the rule of law, while Trump's foes, including Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill, lambasted him for striking Venezuela without approval from Congress and questioned whether his agenda is really America first. For months, Trump has hinted at taking action in Venezuela, telling NBC News last month, "I don't rule it out," when he was asked about going to war with Venezuela. Last month, the U.S. intercepted 2 oil tankers off Venezuela, and the U.S. military continued its strikes on boats allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean Sea. On Friday, just a day before he was captured, Maduro said in an interview on Venezuelan state television that he would be open to working with the U.S. to combat drug trafficking. The U.S. government knows, because we've told many of their spokespeople, that if they want to seriously discuss an agreement to combat drug trafficking, we're ready, he said. On Saturday morning, Democratic lawmakers criticized the Trump administration for launching strikes on Venezuela, specifically pointing to the fact that the White House did not seek approval from Congress for the military action. Maduro is an illegitimate ruler, but I have seen no evidence that his presidency poses a threat that would justify military action without congressional authorization, Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said in a statement Saturday. In a separate statement, Senator Andy Kim, D&J, said Trump rejected our constitutionally required approval process for armed conflict because the administration knows the American people overwhelmingly reject risks pulling our nation into another war. In a phone interview on Fox News late Saturday morning, Trump pushed back against Democrats' criticism, calling them weak, stupid people. All they do is complain. They should say, "You know what? We did a great job." They do say, "Oh, gee, maybe it's not constitutional," the same old stuff that we've been hearing for years and years and years. Trump added that congressional leaders were not notified in part because Congress has a tendency to leak. U.S. lawmakers were kept in the dark ahead of attack. 2 U.S. officials told NBC News that information about the operation was so closely guarded that the Defense Department was not brought into its exact timing until Friday night. Some of Trump's allies on Capitol Hill defended his decision to execute Maduro without congressional authorization. Today's military action in Venezuela was a decisive and justified operation that will protect American lives, House Speaker Mike Johnson, RLA, wrote on X. The Trump administration informed top lawmakers on the Senate and House Intelligence Committees about the U.S. military action to capture Maduro after the operation was underway, 3 sources with knowledge of the matter told NBC News. The Republican chairs and the Democratic ranking members on the intelligence committees were notified about the operation, the sources said. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, RSD, said in a statement that he had spoken to Rubio and is expecting further briefings next week when the Senate returns from the holiday recess. Measure for congressional approval. In early November, a bipartisan group of senators voted in favor of a measure that would have required congressional approval for all future military action by the Trump administration in Venezuela. The measure fell short of the 50 votes needed for passage. The effort behind that measure came after the Trump administration began to publicize declassified videos of the military conducting kinetic strikes on boats allegedly carrying drugs in the Caribbean Sea. In October, Trump said the strikes were part of his administration's fight against drug cartels, but stopped short of saying he'd need a declaration of war to continue striking the boats. He also confirmed that month that he had authorized covert action by the CIA in Venezuela, but did not specify what the action was. A source with knowledge of the matter said Saturday that the CIA had a small clandestine team on the ground starting in August that was able to provide extraordinary insight into Maduro's movements, which made capturing him seamless. The clandestine team had the help of a human source inside the leader's circle, according to a source with knowledge of the matter. The New York Times first reported on the informant inside the regime. Trump references Cuba. Near the end of his news conference, Trump called the situation in Cuba similar to that in Venezuela, responding to a question about potential military involvement in that country. I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about, because Cuba is a failing nation right now, a very badly failing nation, and we want to help the people. It's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba. Rubio, whose parents immigrated to the U.S. from Cuba, said, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned." Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel said Saturday on X that Cuba denounces the U.S. strikes on Venezuela. His country urgently demands the reaction of the international community against the criminal attack of the U.S. on Venezuela. Our zona de paz is being brutally assaulted. State terrorism against the brave Venezuelan people and against our America. Homeland or death, we shall overcome.
In Venezuela, people were unsure how to react. Numerous streets in Caracas, where the smell of gunpowder lingered, appeared deserted in the early hours of Saturday. Some people who went out in search of basic necessities, such as diapers, found that most businesses were closed, including pharmacies, supermarkets, and gas stations. The speed, the violence. Trump, vacationing for a long stretch in South Florida, offered little indication he was planning one of the most consequential actions of either of his presidencies. Instead, he went about his usual rhythms, days at the golf course, dinners on the Mar-a-Lago patio, and hosting a New Year's Eve gala that featured a performance by Vanilla Ice. In the hours before he gave the final go-ahead, the president met at his golf club with Vice President J.D. Vance to discuss the strikes, but Vance returned home to Cincinnati after the operation began. Vance joined several late-night meetings via secure video conference with top national security officials leading up to the operation. A Vance spokesperson said the Trump National Security Team was concerned a late-night motorcade movement by the vice president while the operation was getting underway may tip off the Venezuelans. Trump, meanwhile, watched the complex capture play out in real time from a room in Mar-a-Lago alongside military generals. "If you would have seen what happened, I watched it literally like I was watching a television show," he mused later, calling in to Fox News. If you would have seen the speed, the violence, it was an amazing thing, amazing job that these people did. There's nobody else could have done anything like it, Trump added. He had much less to say about what it might look like for the U.S. to run Venezuela, offering vague allusions to a group that would govern the 31 million people who live there. And while he seemed confident Venezuela's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, would do what he thinks is necessary to make Venezuela great again, Rodriguez came out 2 hours afterward to insist her country had been savagely attacked by the operation. It all made for a startlingly unclear picture of what might come next, despite the months of planning that got Trump to Saturday. Asked by CNN whether he'd taken into consideration the mixed track record of American efforts to oust dictators, the president set himself apart. That's when we had different presidents, but with me, that's not true. With me, we've had a perfect track record of winning. Maduro arrives in New York as Trump says the U.S. will govern Venezuela until there's a proper transition. Trump said the U.S. captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife following military strikes on the country and flew them to the United States to face charges. President Trump said the U.S. will temporarily run Venezuela and work to tap the country's massive oil reserves. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition to new leadership, Trump said at a news conference in Florida. He didn't provide more detail about how the U.S. would control Venezuela, saying a group of officials would be named to oversee it. Trump said he didn't want a new leader to take over in the wake of Maduro's capture, who would result in the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. We can't take a chance that somebody else takes over Venezuela that doesn't have the good of the Venezuelan people in mind. Not afraid of boots on the ground. Trump added that the U.S. military was prepared to strike Venezuela again if needed. We're ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave if we need to do so. After reporters asked whether the U.S. running Venezuela will involve military personnel on the ground, Trump said, "We're not afraid of boots on the ground. We're not afraid to say it, but we're going to make sure that that country is run properly. We're not doing this in vain," he added. Trump's remarks were delivered at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, where he was flanked by some of his top advisors, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Asked later Saturday whether he was prepared to have troops on the ground in Venezuela, Hegseth told CBS News that Trump would set the terms, and ultimately, he'll decide what the iterations of that are. We're going to control what happens next. Because of this brave decision, President Trump has shown American leadership, and he'll be able to dictate where we go next. Maduro flown to New York. Trump confirmed at the news conference that Maduro and his wife were en route to New York, where, he said, Maduro had been indicted. Maduro arrived in New York Saturday afternoon and could appear in court as early as Monday. Trump said that Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as president just a little while ago, and that she had a gracious conversation with Rubio to offer her support. But on state television later, Rodriguez told the Venezuelan public, "We demand the immediate liberation of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores," calling Maduro the only president of Venezuela. Venezuela's Supreme Court on Saturday night issued an order instructing Rodriguez to assume the role of acting president with immediate effect. U.S. capture of Maduro was months in the making. The military operation, which officials said had been planned for months and took several hours, is the latest move that the Trump administration has described as part of a crackdown on drugs entering the U.S. It comes just weeks before the first anniversary of Trump's second inauguration. Two U.S. officials familiar with the planning on Saturday said Trump approved the military and law enforcement actions in Venezuela more than a week ago. In remarks Saturday, Kaine confirmed that military forces waited over a week for the weather to clear up. Weather in Venezuela is always a factor this time of the year, and over the weeks through Christmas and New Year's, the men and women of the United States military sat ready, patiently waiting for the right triggers to be met and the president to order us into action. Kaine said last night the weather broke just enough, clearing a path that only the most skilled aviators in the world could maneuver through. Kaine said that Trump gave the order at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time Friday, and that military forces arrived at Maduro's compound at 1:01 a.m. Eastern Time Saturday. By 3:39 a.m. Saturday, Kaine said the military forces were back over water with Maduro and Flores. Trump, who said he watched the operation unfold live from Mar-a-Lago, said Maduro was trying to get into a safe place made of steel as U.S. military forces stormed his compound. He was trying to get to a safe place which wasn't safe because we would have had the door blown up in about 47 seconds. It was a very thick door, a very heavy door, but he was unable to get to that door. He made it to the door, he was unable to close it. Kaine said the aircraft used in the operation included multiple types of military planes, as well as remotely piloted drones, which he said helped protect the helicopters and personnel in Caracas. Kaine added that U.S. helicopters were fired upon, and that U.S. forces replied to that fire with overwhelming force in self-defense. Kaine added one U.S. military aircraft sustained damage but was still able to fly. Later Saturday, a U.S. official and a White House official told NBC News that the operation in Caracas resulted in several injuries to U.S. troops, all of whom remain stable. Vice President J.D. Vance was also involved in the military operations, according to a spokesperson. Indictment allegations. Minutes before he spoke at Mar-a-Lago, Trump posted a photo appearing to show Maduro aboard the USS Ikariwama wearing what appeared to be a blindfold and holding a bottle of water. Trump also posted a video of the U.S. strikes on Venezuela set to Fortunate Son, a famous anti-war song by Creedence Clearwater. Attorney General Pam Bondi said on X that Maduro would face the full wrath of the U.S. justice system. The indictment, in an indictment unsealed Saturday, include narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. In the indictment, federal prosecutors alleged Maduro is at the forefront of that corruption and has partnered with his co-conspirators to use his illegally obtained authority and the institutions he corroded to transport thousands of tons of cocaine to the United States. They also alleged Maduro and other members of the Venezuelan government sold passports, provided protection, and enabled the sale and transportation of hundreds of tons of illegal drugs through their ports, including drugs from several recognized Mexican drug cartels. In his remarks, Trump said he had seen the evidence that was gathered for the indictment, and he blamed Maduro for drug trafficking and crime in the U.S. "I've seen what we have. It's both horrible and breathtaking that something like this could have been allowed to take place for many years after his term as president of Venezuela expired." Maduro remained